In a U.S. House committee hearing Wednesday, Assistant Secretary of State Roberto Jacobson defended the recent U.S. policy change on Cuba, despite strong criticism from Republican-led Congress. She also admitted the half-century freeze in ties and the U.S. economic embargo had isolated the United States from democratic partners in this hemisphere. She also said she did not expect change in the Cuban government.
The whole point of this new policy is not that we are telescoping to the Cuban government that they don't have to change or that we expect them to change right away. Certainly we want those practices to change. We simply are not naive about how quickly they may change, and so our efforts are to empower the Cuban people to take their lives into their own hands.
For more on this story, we go to our correspondent Alexandra Hall in Washington.
Testifying to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday, Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson made one thing clear. The issue of Guantanamo is not on the negotiating table.
Obviously, the Cuban government has raised Guantanamo. We are not interested in discussing that. We are not discussing that issue or return of Guantanamo.
Among other conditions, Cuban President Raúl Castro recently announced that normalizing relations would be impossible if the United States does not close the prison and return the naval base on which it stands to the Cuban people.
It's a legitimate request of the Cuban government to say, this is our land. I mean, can you imagine if the Cubans had one little piece of South Florida, a naval base there, and that's theirs? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Republican senators repeatedly accused negotiating administration officials of granting concessions to the Cuban government, a position that critics peg as political strategy in the run-up to the 2016 presidential elections.
Most people have issues like jobs and the economy on their mind, not U.S. relations with Cuba. And in fact, the polls show that the majority of Americans want better relations with our Cuban neighbors. So I think it's unfortunate that there are some congressmen and senators who continue to take this hardline policy because they think it's good for their political futures.
According to the latest studies, 45% of Americans support full diplomatic relations with Cuba, and 60% want the economic embargo to end.
We should be fully cooperative, fully collaborative, good neighbors and good partners.
And certainly there are things that will need to be worked out, but I think it's worth working on.
This week's hearings are just the first steps in a long process of reestablishing diplomacy between the United States and Cuba. The actual normalization of relations, that's a process that will likely take years. Alexandra Hall, Telesur, Washington.